Friends, how about it? 10 years together, we've been through a lot, both troubles and joys. It would seem that what else is needed to be happy? And I, frankly speaking, was sure that my Grace is the person with whom we will drink tea in the kitchen, grumble at each other and laugh until old age. But you know, things happen in life, and as it turns out, loyalty isn't the most obvious of qualities, especially when that friend from work looms on the horizon.
Thank you for watching my channel. I create videos for your enjoyment. Please subscribe if you want to support my efforts, it's very important to me. I apologize in advance for any mistakes, dubbing is done by neural network. Please point out mistakes in the comments so I can correct them.
I'll be honest with you, I wasn't immediately prepared for what was in store for me. It started with little things, late arrivals, minor changes in appearance. Oh come on, I thought, maybe she just decided to take care of herself. Well, you know, as it happens, when the wife suddenly begins every day in front of the mirror to spin around, sniff some new perfume. Men, you too have probably seen this. Only trouble is, my intuition didn't let me down. One day, when Grace once again said she'd be late, I decided to dig a little deeper. We share a computer, and no, don't think, I didn't go through her stuff right away. It's not our custom, and it's embarrassing. But then something pricked me. I went in and saw something I never expected to see. A friend from work turned out to be a suitor, hints, frank words, plans for joint work evenings. You know what I mean, right? And here my cheeks began to burn not from jealousy, but from the realization that all this friendship I've been watching with my own eyes for months. At first, of course, I wanted to drop everything and make a grandiose scandal, as in some TV series. But then I thought, no, I'm not that simple. If I've been so well fooled, I'd like to get a decent return. But what kind? And now it was beginning to turn into an interesting game, to study her every move, her habits, meetings. I thought it was kind of fun. All the more I decided first to understand how far they had gone, so that later, when the bomb exploded, no one could say that I was unnecessarily inflaming the conflict. Anyway, a couple days later, I noticed one thing. Not only does Grace and this coworker look at each other in a meaningful way, but her job itself has become something of a lifeline for her. She suddenly decides to stay out late. She doesn't show who she's talking to. It's got me thinking about doing a little corporate revenge. You know what they say, what goes around comes around. Looks like their affair was just ripe to be the perfect bait for my purposes. And that's when, friends, I turned on my inner strategic mind and started developing a plan. Oh, how I love that, thinking out every step, every detail, so that neither one nor the other can guess where the wind is blowing from. For now, I just watched. Why make a showdown at once, when you can make it so that they will start tearing and throwing themselves, just to hide the traces? But I won't get ahead of myself. The fun is just beginning. I want to put all these little details on the shelves, and at the end to give such a surprise that they will remember for a long time, with whom they should not have contacted. Anyway, make yourselves comfortable. Trust me, it's going to get even more interesting. So you're probably thinking, what's next is me grabbing her arm and throwing a tantrum. No, friends, I'm not that kind of guy. That's where my nature would fail me if I blew up without thinking. You know, in some situations, it's better to calculate first than to jump right in. I realized that if I was going to start anything, it would have to be with evidence and a plan to make this little comedy a real tragedy for both of them. At first I started with little things, screenshots of their correspondence, really accidental meetings near her work, when I just happened to stop by to buy something and she, naturally, wasn't expecting me. It's interesting how in such moments a person's face changes, as if everything is written in large letters. What is he doing here? And I pretend I don't see anything, say hello, smile. The main thing is to keep a low profile, not to show that you know anything. That, you know, gets on your nerves better than any truth. The feeling of being suspected, it gnaws at you from the inside. After a week, I noticed my tactics were starting to pay off. Grace became more nervous. Every call and text was stressing her out, and I was just watching. She seemed afraid of her own shadow. Maybe she was starting to wonder if someone had exposed her. I even wondered who would be the first to flinch, her or her friend from work. I'm not going to lie, there was something satisfying about it, seeing a person build a cage for themselves, and you don't even make much of an effort. And then it hit me, what if you create even more pressure? You know, right? If a person starts to suspect that their secret might come out, it's best to fuel the fire and let those thoughts take root. After all, any lie needs feeding. The more Grace spun around in front of the mirror, the more she whispered on the phone, the more her anxiety built up. I decided to play along a little. I asked her one day in between, "How's your coworker doing? Is everything okay?" She flinched, but I pretended not to notice and continued as if nothing had happened. Then I realized that her nerves were starting to give out. There was one thing though. My goal wasn't just to get her to come clean. No, that would be too easy. My goal was to make their little friendship turn into big trouble, and not just for her, but for him as well. If you want revenge, do it in such a way that your every move is thought out. I wanted no one to want to mess with other people's wives after that, and Grace herself would remember that lesson for life. That's when I decided to set off a little bomb. No overt exposure, just a few conversations with the right people. Talked to her superiors, carefully hinted at friendship between coworkers, but in a way that didn't make it obvious it was from me. "You know," I said, "an acquaintance of mine tells me that Grace and this coworker of hers are now inseparable. I wonder what's really going on there? I mean, work is about the job, not about anything else, right?" The bosses reacted suspiciously, as they should. We're too strict with these corporate ties. And that's where it gets interesting. Once you start a machine like this, there's no turning back. Her boss was an old-school, pedantic guy. He heard the hints, and the next day, she had an inspection. Grace, of course, did not understand anything, began to ask me, say, "Where are such rumors?" And I looked at her and just shrugged my shoulders. Who knows, maybe people made up something for themselves. And you know, at that moment I caught myself thinking, how nice it is to see how a person is spinning in a trap that he has set for himself. How ironic that this whole affair could have been avoided if she had thought of someone other than herself for once in her life. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The story is just getting started. As it turns out, our Grace not only has problems with her superiors on the horizon, but also with that very friend. Apparently he, too, began to realize that the smell of fry, and began to somehow distant. It's a classic story. As soon as problems start, friends become not so friends, right? And that's where the good stuff starts. Who will betray whom first and how far they will go to save their own skin. My goal was to create a situation for them where neither of them could get away with it. Intrigue? Of course. And so, friends, as they say, a mess was brewing. I watched Grace try her best to keep a straight face, but internally it was like someone was eating her up. You know, it's an amazing sight when a person is trying their best to hide their anxiety, but their hands are still shaking, their voice faltering, their eyes running. At such moments it seems that she has already given herself away in front of everyone, although, in fact, no one knows anything concrete. And I pretend not to notice. It's a special art, folks. Sometimes silence says more than 1,000 words. Meanwhile, her coworker, this friend of hers, was showing real signs of concern. Apparently, the rumors were beginning to concern him even more than her. On the one hand, he knew that having affairs at work was not a good idea. On the other hand, this mess was too hot to get out of so easily. So I imagined him coming home every night and wondering if his wife would find out, if the gossip would reach her ears. And most importantly, whether the bosses, who, as I had already realized, would not tolerate such side connections. Of course, I added oil to the fire carefully and unobtrusively. You see, if you want to start a real fire, you don't need to throw a torch into a pile of straw. It's just a matter of quietly directing the fire in the right direction. I kept my distance so no one would suspect I was the one who started the gossip. It wasn't easy, but it was worth the effort. Friends, you should have seen how funny she got every time one of her coworkers spotted her in the company of this friend. Now my task was simple, to carefully set things up so that her superiors would think that these two were a potential risk to the company's reputation. I started making up a story about some fake project, as if I'd gotten an order from the company where Grace and her suitor work. Of course, it's all bogus. But who says revenge has to be fair? I put all the details together to make this project look real, did the paperwork, even created a couple fake documents. In short, with a project like this, anyone would think it was a real job. And so, this friend of mine, Grace, enthusiastically took on the task. A few weeks went by. Oh, those weeks were sweet. I watched every day as he and Grace hid their looks like school children, all the while thinking that the whole world revolved around their little secret. And I kept planning how this project would come crashing down on both of them in an instant. And then the day came. Friday morning. A seemingly normal work day. But on this particular day, I went to the head of the company and I said, We seem to be having some serious problems with this project. For some reason, it's all gone wrong. Maybe someone should have watched their work better." The supervisor looked puzzled, then indignant. "You understand, don't you?" To him, it looked like a failure of the whole department. And then began the chain of events I'd been building up for so long. By late afternoon, Grace's colleague was called in to talk to his superiors. The colors on his face changed one after another, as if he suddenly realized that he had fallen into a deep hole. Yes, it was even a little sad, but honestly, I didn't feel the slightest regret. Because a person who goes to such lengths should realize that there could be consequences. And so he was forced to explain himself, but as you can imagine, the explanations led nowhere. A couple days later, Grace's coworker was fired. Just like that, no questions asked. His reputation was now completely ruined. Grace was suddenly alone in her illusion, where she thought she had everything under control. And that's when things started to get interesting. She tried to talk to me, but I pretended it was no big deal. Why would you do that? Because I was just watching. She went around the house, trying to explain that her friend was unfairly fired, but I told her simply, "Well, it happens. I guess the bosses didn't like the way he worked." The poor girl thought she could tell me something, but I held my ground. The more she floundered, the more I wanted to see how far she would go to cover up the evidence of her mistake. Now that she'd lost her support at work, her world began to crumble before her eyes. But it wasn't over yet. I still had my trump cards to play, and I knew she'd soon realize she shouldn't play with fire, especially when there was someone around to add oil. What do you think, huh? The intrigue is growing, and the best part is just ahead. Well, folks, our plan is slowly gaining momentum. After her coworker was fired, Grace became even more like a hunted animal. She was confused and scared, though of course she was careful to pretend everything was fine. But I could see that there was more behind that facade. Every breath she took, every movement gave away how afraid she was that the whole story might now come out. And that was the best part, seeing a person start to fall from the top of their confidence all by themselves, and you only nudge them down a little. After all, she had a choice. We could have just lived peacefully, enjoyed what we had. But no, she needed that flirting, those secret emails and late nights. And now? Now every night she sat across from me, not knowing what to say. Our dinners had become like a silent show, with one pretending nothing was happening and the other trying to hide the fact that life was falling apart around her. At one point, I thought it would be okay to stop. But, admittedly, I even enjoyed it. This game of silence, this unhurried but constant psychological attack. Don't let her think it's going to end so easily. She was just beginning to feel what it was like to lose control. That's exactly the feeling I wanted to maintain for as long as possible. Of course, sometimes she tried to bring it up. "Thomas, maybe we need to talk." She started one evening, looking at me with a guilty look. But I, as if nothing had happened, just smiled. "What's there to talk about? We're fine, you're just tired from work, right?" She nodded, but I could see her face tighten, as if I'd just spit in her soul. And that's when I started thinking about the next step. Since her romance at work had fallen apart, I might as well direct her thoughts toward home. Make her feel trapped not only at work, but also in her own family. I started making small comments, for example, that I had some work girl who understood me. Of course, I made it up as I went along, but I watched her reaction. She flinched every time I mentioned something related to female attention or just delays at work. I needed her to realize that she wasn't the only one who could play these games. When I left my phone on my desk one evening, supposedly by accident, and she saw a pop-up message with a nice compliment from a non-existent coworker, her face darkened. I heard her open her mouth to ask something, but probably realized it was better to keep quiet. Let her feel what it was like to wait and wonder what was going on behind her back. Let her understand what it's like to live with the feeling of not being told. Now we were playing a double game. She pretended not to notice. I pretended nothing was happening. We lived like neighbors, who accidentally cross paths in the kitchen, exchange duty phrases and immediately go to different corners. But every day, I saw her inner panic grow stronger. And strangely enough, I felt even better. This little revenge was something of a personal triumph, proof that life can sometimes be fair. A couple more weeks went by. Her fired coworker had disappeared from the horizon, and Grace was now apparently only staying at work for fear of losing her too. Did she have any pride? Yes, of course she did. But fear was stronger, and now her every move was only to save what was left of her reputation. A couple of times I heard her talking to her friends, complaining that she wasn't trusted at work anymore and no one wanted to hang out with her. It was so good to hear that, friends. It was like all her lies were starting to boomerang back to her. But there was one moment I was looking forward to in particular. I knew that sooner or later she wouldn't stand for it and try to find out how far my suspicions went. And that moment didn't take long to arrive. One evening, after a particularly silent dinner, she suddenly turned abruptly to me and asked, "Thomas, tell me honestly, do you know something? Do you suspect me of something?" I made a surprised face, sighed and quietly replied, "Grace, why would I suspect you of anything? We have complete trust, don't we?" Her eyes flickered nervously, and I could see that she was stumping herself. You see, the most important thing in this situation is not to give her any concrete answers. Let her get lost in the guesswork. Let her guess how deep she was in the hole. At this point, I knew I was close. She would become her own worst enemy, and no one would be able to help her out of this trap. What's next? Next is where the fun begins. As they say, stay tuned, there's more to come. Well, my dears, if you thought this was where it would end, you were certainly mistaken. Just when she seemed already exhausted, I decided to add a little spice. After all, you have to admit, one small revenge is good, but if you do it gradually, drop by drop, so to speak, the effect will be much more lasting. This time I decided to use one more trick. I remembered that Grace had a small but very personal weakness, her reputation. She has always tried to look like a perfect wife and a model employee. It didn't seem unusual, but her narcissism and her desire to seem better than everyone else was exactly what I needed to destroy her world. I started small. A couple of times accidentally, went to social networks and pretended that accidentally left open her page, where you can see her photos with colleagues at work meetings. It would seem like what's the big deal? But strangely enough, she immediately became wary and started nervously asking why I was looking at her page. And that's when I realized, for the first time, that she was beginning to realize how close her whole game was to being exposed. I wasn't answering her questions. On the contrary, I was avoiding answering, saying something inarticulate like I was just looking to see what's new, and then immediately turning the conversation to something else. It seemed like a small tactic, but believe me, it worked. Grace started to lose confidence and became afraid to leave her phone or laptop unattended even at home. Well, let her feel that her life is now in the palm of her hand. Let her realize that her every move is under control. Meanwhile, I started making a little joke about how some women can be sneaky and sneaky. You know, that kind of talk about morals and principles. Talked in generalities, of course, but I only needed to see her face to realize that she understood perfectly well. At such times she pretended not to listen, but her eyes gave her away. I think she felt cornered, not knowing what to do next. But that wasn't all. I remembered that Grace had a good friend, a gossipy gossip, who she'd been wanting to introduce to me for a long time. So I decided to arrange a meeting, but to talk to her alone, without Grace. We met at a cafe, I ordered tea and started with a light conversation. But very quickly it turned to the fact that Grace was rumored to be in some kind of trouble at work, and that supposedly I was worried about her morale. Imagine how this friend took my words. She immediately started asking me what was going on, and of course I didn't tell her everything, just hinted that sometimes work can be difficult, especially when there are difficult relationships with coworkers. It was enough that in a couple of days the rumor about our family problems began to go around town. Of course, my friend couldn't keep her mouth shut and decided to tell everyone that Grace was going through some difficult times and that her colleagues were noticing changes in her behavior. The rumor spread quickly, and I saw Grace becoming more and more anxious every day. Even at home, she was uneasy, constantly looking around as if she was waiting for something else to happen. And me? I just watched. I sat and watched as everything she'd been so careful to hide began to fall apart right in front of her eyes. There was no need to do anything concrete anymore. It was enough to see the confusion, fear, and helplessness that increasingly surrounded her. My revenge took on a new taste, the taste of her panic and the realization that she was completely trapped. And then one evening, when she seemed to have had enough of the whole game, Grace suddenly came up to me and said, "Thomas, let's talk. I think there's something wrong with us." I looked at her like she was a stranger, sighed and said, "Grace, if you have something to say, you better say it now. Maybe it's not all lost yet." She froze, like she didn't expect me to say something like that, and just stayed silent. She clearly wasn't ready for that answer. Apparently, she thought I was going to try to calm her down or something. But, as they say, you reap what you sow. In the end, we sat in the kitchen, each of us immersed in our own thoughts. She was trying to find words, and I was just waiting for her to admit that she had driven herself into this hole. But the confession didn't come. She seemed ready to ruin everything rather than talk openly. It was her choice, and all I had to do was watch her make it. But I didn't stop there. I haven't told her the most important truth yet. That I know everything and that I'm no longer the naive husband I used to be. As they say, the end is near, friends, and it's going to be a beautiful end. Well, friends, we're nearing the end. As the saying goes, when you play the game, be prepared that the other player has his moves too. I watched Grace and saw her panic growing by the day. I didn't rush things. Let things take their course. My job is to be a spectator, privileged to see her inner world crumble. It has to be said that at this stage, she stopped trusting everyone around her. Even her friends, even her co-workers. She suddenly began to suspect that someone was spreading rumors, that someone knew about her secrets, and that her whole life was becoming a misunderstanding. But, interestingly enough, she was now wary of me too. I could see it in the way she looked at me, the way she reacted to my words, and the way she avoided unnecessary conversation. So one night, I decided to do something that would finally shatter her confidence. I came home a little later than usual, deliberately staying out late so that she would think I was somewhere, perhaps not where she was used to seeing me. A shadow of alarm flashed across her face as soon as I crossed the threshold. As they say, her own games were beginning to fail her. You see, people who are involved in mysteries begin to see conspiracies and suspect everyone around them. As I changed my clothes and looked at her casually, I said, "It's been a long day today. I've had to talk to some interesting people, but it's funny how sometimes unexpected details about our loved ones are revealed." I purposely chose words like that, ambiguous, a hint of something important, but without too much detail. And, as I expected, she immediately became nervous, as if trying to construct a picture in her head of what I might have learned. Her face flushed, her eyes darted around, and I just watched. The next day, I went even further. I left a couple of random messages on my phone, sent to myself, but from a different number, that hinted at some kind of meetings and some kind of conversations. It was enough of a scrap to make her suspicious. Of course, I knew she wouldn't stand for it and would get into my phone. And so she did. When I got home, I caught her trying to accidentally check my messages. She saw that I was supposedly being texted by interesting co-workers. Her face turned stony at this. She closed her phone as if nothing had happened, but her reaction told me all I needed to know. Her mind was already bubbling with thoughts, and I was sure she was now feeling the same pain, the same doubts that I had felt when I first realized she had betrayed me. Now we were starting to play open innuendo. She would try to catch me at some word or look, and I would keep my distance, just watching. But friends, I didn't care how she felt. I knew one thing: revenge had achieved its goal. She was confused, she had become a stranger in our home, in our relationship, she no longer knew who she was to me and who I was to her. That was my victory. And then the day came when I decided to end it all. We were sitting at dinner and I suddenly spoke up. "Grace, we seemed to have everything nice and simple, didn't we? We lived our lives, trusted each other, made plans. But sometimes I wonder why people drop everything so easily for a fling." She froze as if I'd hit her. She looked at me like she realized I knew everything. It wasn't that I was being direct, it didn't make sense. But I said exactly what I had to say to make her realize. Her world had collapsed. She tried to say something, but I stopped her. "No excuses needed, Grace. Just know one thing, that's the end of it. I can see right through you. You're the one who ruined everything we had. And if it cost you your late-night conversations, your meetings, and your secret friend, well, that's your choice." And just like that, friends, I've put an end to our story. No more words, no more scandal, just walked away from the table and out of that house, leaving her alone with her fears, regrets, and loneliness. She knew that it was over now and that nothing could be taken back. As they say, life is the best teacher. It teaches us that there are consequences for every action. And if you choose to break a trust, be prepared to pay the price someday. And sometimes that price is a lot higher than you ever imagined. So, how's that for an ending? Sometimes the best way to get revenge is to just walk away, leaving behind nothing but emptiness and disappointment. Or better yet, leave a man alone with his own guilt. Let him eat it, let him chew on it, let him stay with it for the rest of his life. That's the end of the story. I hope you've learned something useful from it. As always, there's more to come. Look forward to more stories. Thank you for being with me throughout this story. If you enjoyed it, give it a like, subscribe, and look forward to more unexpected twists and life lessons.